Welcome to the Big Game Hunting Podcast, where we help hunters like you prepare for the big game hunting adventures you've always dreamed of. Now, here's your host, John McAdams.
Hello, John McAdams here, and you are listening to episode 222 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. As promised, today I have a more comprehensive recap of my recent Colorado trip where we were after pronghorn and bison. Now, unlike the previous episode, it's just me in this one, and I'll talk about my experience in more detail to include some reflections on how my equipment performed. Before we get started, I have a very important announcement for you, though. Like I mentioned in the previous episode, I'm giving away a $50 Cabela's gift card that is good at any Cabela's or Bass Pro location or online. Now, to enter, you need to be on my email list and have a confirmed email address. Now, I was having subscribers not receiving my emails or having my messages go to their junk folders automatically. For that reason, I'm doing some things on my end that should help deliverability, and one of the things that I'm doing is taking some steps to clean some of the junk email addresses off of my list and ensure it is only full of people who want to hear from me on a regular basis. And when I do this, it should help ensure that the rest of you that want to be hearing from me all the time get my emails when I actually send them out. So, to do this, I sent some messages to subscribers over the weekend, asking them to click on a link in the message to confirm their email address. If you got that email and you clicked the link, or if you did that weeks or months ago, then you're all set. If you didn't click the link or you just deleted the email, it's okay. I'm sending out another blast of confirmation emails today, Tuesday, 18 October. Click the link when you get it and you'll be all set. If you don't get any of those emails, or if you're not on my list, or if you're not sure, email me, john@thebiggamehuntingblog.com, and we will sort things out for you. Next Friday, 28 October, I'm going to announce the winner of this giveaway via email. So you need to be on my list, have a confirmed email address, and be on the lookout for my message to win. If you don't respond within 24 hours, I'm moving on to someone else. Now, there's also a link in the show notes for some steps you can take with the various email providers, right? Gmail, Outlook, Hotmail, all of that stuff. In any case, there's some steps you can take with those services to reduce the odds my messages go to your promotions tab, your junk email folder, etc. Follow the instructions in there to add me to your safe senders list, and make sure you get my emails regularly to include the email someone is going to get saying they're the winner. Email me, john@thebiggamehuntingblog.com, with questions. I get feedback all the time from people telling me how much they enjoy receiving the emails I send out every weekday, so make sure you're getting them too. Okay, let's talk about this hunting trip. Now, as you know, I use and promote Axle hearing protection. Well, the folks at Axle set up this trip to test out some new products and to improve their relationship with some of their affiliates. So there was a group of us, me, Adam, better known as Hootie Hoo, Steve, better known as Mr. Big Kid, Colin, who works for the marketing company that's the go-between for Axle and guys like me, Weston, who's the CEO of Axle, Ray, who is one of Weston's business partners, and Jake, who is Weston's son and who also works for Axle. Now, Jake was just hunting antelope. The rest of us are after antelope and bison. All right, now, the Hartey's Ranch is in southern Colorado, just west of the town of Trinidad, if you know where that is, off I-25. Well, I drove out there, which is one seriously long day from East Texas, but it just so happened I was the first one to arrive. Colin, Steve, and Adam all flew into Colorado Springs, rented a car, then drove in together. They arrived a little after I did, and then we all immediately went to the range together to check our zero. I'm a gun nerd, and I drove, so I brought 4 rifles with me on this hunt. My Bergara Wilderness Terrain in 6.5 Creedmoor, my CVA Paramount muzzleloader, my Ruger Hawkeye FTW Hunter in 300 Win Mag, and my Ruger M77 Mark II in 375 H&H. My plan was to use the Bergara 6.5 Creedmoor on the antelope and the Paramount muzzleloader on the bison. Now, Freddie Hartey's owns the ranch and also hunted with us, and Colin coordinated all the various details of the hunt with Freddie. From my discussions with Colin, There was no issue using the Paramount on the bison. Now, bison are not a game animal in Colorado, so the normal rules regarding muzzleloaders in the state don't apply for hunters pursuing bison. So the plan was to shoot the bison in the spine, just behind and below the ear. They recommended a 300 Win Mag or larger for that work, but the idea was that we were going to get within 100 yards of the bison and take a shot on a stationary animal. If all went well, the bison would drop right there. Like I said, the plan was to use the Paramount, though, and I brought the 300 Win Mag as a backup just in case something got lost in translation from Freddie to Colin to me, and I brought the 375 as a backup to the backup in case things went really wrong. But Freddie said it'd be fine when I talked to him in person. So with that in mind, I just brought my Bergara and my Paramount shooting that evening when we all went to go check zero. Both shot well, but both were hitting a little high and a little to the left. Not super surprising, though, since I went from zero to basically sea level here in East Texas to shooting at about 8,000 feet above sea level in that part of Colorado. It was a simple matter of adjusting the scope slightly, and my next group was dead on the money with both the Paramount and the Creedmoor. We wrapped things up there and then headed back to the lodge, got dinner, and made a plan for the next day. At this point, Weston, Jake, and Ray still hadn't arrived. They were also driving, but ran into some terrible traffic on the way in from Salt Lake City, and they even got in a minor fender bender on the way. In any case, Freddie filled in everyone on the plan for the next day. Colin and Steve were heading out for bison. Everyone else was going for antelope. Like we referenced in the last podcast, bison and antelope are both located a pretty decent drive from the lodge. The antelope are around an hour away, clear on the other side of Trinidad, out in the more open country, and the bison are about 3 to 4 hours away to the northwest. And, for reference, we were hunting bison in a little west, maybe northwest of Colorado Springs. Now, additionally, Freddie has a couple different properties he hunts antelope on. It's for the most part private land that's primarily used for grazing cattle, and he leases the antelope hunting rights on that land. It's all east of I-25, spread out over a pretty big area that actually spans multiple GMUs. Well, he had Colin, Steve, Jake, Weston, and I put in for one GMU, and then Adam and Ray put in for another one. Freddie paired Jake and Weston with one guide the next morning, and I happened to be hunting one-on-one with a different guide. This same guide I was with would also guide Colin and Steve, but they were hunting bison that morning, so it was just he and I. We all left the lodge around 5 a.m., drove into Trinidad, and that's where we met up with the other guides, and that is where I met Cliff. And Cliff was going to be guiding me on this hunt for antelope. He and I chatted for a couple minutes in the truck out to where we were going to be hunting, and I had him pull off to the side on a dirt road so I could get things sorted out before the sun came up. He checked my license to make sure we were straight there, and while he did that, I started getting my rifle ready. And then at one point, I pulled out my Banish 30 suppressor and started screwing it onto the end of my barrel, and Cliff's eyes got real wide. He said, "What are you doing? Those are illegal." I said, "What? No, this is fine. I have my ATF Form 4. They're legal to hunt with in Colorado. Everything is good." And he calmed down and apologized, and he said he'd never actually seen one before. And after that, we got back in, and we started driving towards where we were going to hunt. He told me that he had seen 4 different groups of antelope the previous evening, and each herd contained a mature buck. And like we mentioned in the previous episode, we were in the tail end of the antelope rut. Most of the action was over, but every now and then we'd run into a situation where one of the does would run off, and then the buck would run after her and chase her and try and get her back into the herd. So those big mature bucks were still hanging with all their does, and there was a little bit of breeding activity going on right there. But like I said, the most of it was over with. So you'd have these herds of several does and fawns together, and with one mature buck with them. And then there would be some smaller bucks that were kind of hanging out on their own, and sometimes they would try and sneak in and try and get with the does or maybe peel one off from that herd. And so those more mature bucks that were with the herds of does were really moving around, herding these does around, chasing after them when they'd run off. So they were just kind of all over the place. It was very interesting seeing that. On my previous antelope hunts, that was not going on, where at least as far as I could see. So that was a cool new experience. But anyway, like I said, he saw these 4 different groups the previous day. And so as we started driving through this area, we came upon the first group, and it was in a little field right off the road and had a nice buck in it. But literally the sun had just come up. They were right there. And I was like, this looks nice, but I want to keep hunting. Let's see what we can do. And then we kept driving, and we saw another herd, and that one was maybe 800 yards off. It was a pretty good ways out there in the middle of the field. And once again, looked good, but I said, listen, let's go see everything there is to see, and then we'll kind of make a plan here. We're on private land. No one else is hunting here, so I'm not in a big hurry. And he said, okay, no problem. So we kept driving, and we, on this road, went down into a little bottom, and there was a grove of trees down there. And as we rounded the bend around these trees, there was another group of antelope there, but there was also a group of mule deer. And these mule deer spotted us, and we kept driving, but they spooked anyway, and they took off running, and then they pushed all the antelope off there with them. And once again, all of these herds were about the same, say maybe 7 to 8 does, thereabouts, maybe 5 to 10, with one nice buck with them. And they all took off running, and all 3 of these bucks were pretty decent. And I would have been happy to shoot any of them, but like I said, I wasn't in a big hurry, and especially this group kind of took off running. And I said, well, let's let these go. And he took me to where he'd seen the last one. And as we were driving down the road, we were looking on one side, and they weren't there where he saw them the previous day. And then I looked on the other side and saw some antelope, and he's like, oh, okay, they crossed the road during the night. So we saw him out there, and we were looking straight into the sun, though. We were driving east, and it was really bright and kind of hard to see. And they were looking at us and starting to get kind of spooked when we'd stop. And I said, listen, let's just keep driving. Let's go down here. We'll turn around and maybe get a better angle on them. So we drove maybe a mile down the road on the other side of a hill from the antelope, turned around and kind of drove over to the top of it and peeked over. And we were looking at them, and we were a good ways away from them at this point, and the sun was at our back, and it was still real low, so it was hard for them to see us. And like I said, we were a long way away and kind of hidden, so they weren't really spooky at all. And we're looking at him, and he said, this is a nice buck, and this is probably, of these 4 bucks that we saw out here this morning, this is the nicest one. They're all nice. This is the nicest one. I said, okay. I like the setup here. It looks like we'll be able to drive a little bit closer, get out, and then approach him on foot and get a reasonable shot at him. And then if it works, it works. And if not, we'll take a crack at one of the other ones. He said, okay, no problem. So we drove up a couple hundred yards down. The road would kind of go up and down. And when we went down into a lower spot on the road, he pulled off to the side. And then we quietly got out and got all our stuff ready and then started walking in the direction of the antelope. And there was a little bit of, I don't want to call it a valley or a ridge or anything like that. That's too generous. This area was gently rolling terrain. So there was, a little bit of folds out there. It wasn't perfect. It was, more or less flat, but not perfectly flat by any stretch of the imagination. And so we got down into a low spot. And when we were at the very lowest, we could stand up straight and not see the antelope. But as we started walking closer and closer towards them, the ground would gradually slope up. And as we got closer, we'd get higher, and then we could peek over and see him. And so we were crouching, and then we we walked maybe 200 yards, and then we got up to where there were a couple of telephone poles there. And we each stood behind a telephone pole, and we're kind of peeking out and looking at these antelope. And at this point, say we were maybe obscured from the waist down by the ground, and then hiding from behind the telephone poles. We were just kind of peeking a little bit of our upper body out, and they were about 350 yards away, something like that. And they weren't acting nervous. They didn't even act like they saw us out there. And then all of a sudden, one of the does in this group just takes off sprinting, running away. And that my heart kind of dropped when I saw that. I was like, oh my God, they saw us. And then the buck took off running after her. But then we looked back, and all the other does were just kind of sitting there doing their normal thing, eating breakfast like nothing was going on. And I was like, okay, we probably didn't spook them then, if that doe's just running off by herself, and that buck is probably just trying to bring her back, and he'll be back here in a couple minutes. And I kept, Cliff kept looking at the rest of the group, and I was looking to where the other antelope were that had run off. And then sure enough, a couple minutes later, we see that buck just sprinting back. He was by himself, but he was going as fast as he could go, it looked like. And I said, okay, the buck is coming back. And he looked and verified. He said, yep, that looks like that nice buck that was with him. We're good to go here. He's like, do you want to try and shoot from here? And I said, gosh, not really. I can shoot 300 yards, but I don't want to do it standing up, even, using your shoulder or the telephone poles or rest or something. We didn't have shooting sticks. I said, let me try and get closer. And like I said, we had gone down into a low spot in the ground and then walked up this little incline, and it kept going and getting higher, for a period of distance on the other side of the telephone poles towards the antelope. And then it dropped off again and then went up again. There was a fold, and then it went back up to a high spot, and the antelope were on that next high spot. And like I said, they were about 300 yards from where we were standing at that point. There was a cactus between the antelope and us, and it looked like it was towards the top of that little rise in the ground there. And I said, all right, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to crawl up to that cactus. Hopefully it's going to be tall enough where I can, when I get to it, I'll be able to shoot past it, and then I'll be right in a good range for the antelope. And that cactus was maybe 80 yards away, something like that. And Cliff said, okay, no problem. I'm going to stay here, and I'm going to keep watching them and just keep looking back at me, and I'll let you know if something happens and they take off or something. So I said, okay, no problem. So I got down on my hands and knees and started crawling, and I'm getting closer and closer and closer, and I make it up to the cactus, and everything is good. And like I said, it was like a bush of cactuses, not like a big Seguro cactus or something you'd see in Arizona. It was kind of a spiny bush there on the ground. In any case, get up to it, and when I would get up on my hands and knees, I could just barely see him over the ground, but the ground still went up enough on the other side of the bush that I didn't have a clean shot at him. I couldn't shoot from the prone there, in other words. But I looked, ranged him, and we were just right around 200 yards, maybe 220 yards, something like that from him. And I was like, okay, they don't see me. I'm going to keep crawling a little bit at a time. And so I went from crawling on my hands and knees to basically low crawling. And I described this in a previous episode, I think 192 on my hunt in Wyoming, where it was just like being back in my Army days doing basic training, get as low as I could go, cradling my rifle in my arms there, and just kind of pushing myself forward with my feet a little bit forward at a time. And I went another 20 yards or so, and every so often I'd look up and see if I could get a shot, and still couldn't do it. But I get, like I said, around 20 yards past that bush. I put my bipod up, and there was a little grass clump on the ground that was a little bit higher than everything else, and I put my bipod on that to get it as high as possible. And I look through the scope, and then I kind of look along the axis of my barrel, and I said, okay, I think we're good here. I think everything is clear. I got a clear shot at these antelope, and they still don't see me. And so this is what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna shoot from here. And so I had my shooting bag, which is just a sock with a couple other socks stuffed in it, in my pocket. And I got it out and got nice and steady under the butt of my rifle, and I had my Spartan Precision bipod under the front of it. And so everything is good. The antelope still haven't really taken notice of me, and the does and fawns are still kind of eating the little patches of grass and whatnot that are out there, whatever it is that they eat. And they are very slowly working their way towards me. And they'd been doing this the whole time. When I started stalking them, they were at that high point in front of me on that next little, for lack of a better term, that next little ridge. And then they were working their way down into the little, for lack of a better term, the little valley in front of me. But they were doing this very slowly and deliberately, like they didn't have a care in the world. They either didn't know about or didn't care that Cliff and I were there. And meanwhile, this buck is still just running all over the place. He had got that other doe back, and he was just kind of running circles around these does, just trying to keep him in line. And he was really burning his energy that morning. And every now and then he would stop and eat, and then he would start running around and making sure everyone was doing what he wanted them to do. And I had a couple of shots at him when he was towards the top of that little ridge, but this happens kind of frequently with antelope where they'll be standing at high point like that and they're skylined and there's not a good backstop behind them. And I don't like taking a shot like that, right? You're supposed to know what your target is and know behind it. And gosh, in the interest of safety, didn't want to take a shot with him up high like that. And they didn't act like they knew that I was there. So I said, okay, there's no rush. We're going to wait for the perfect shot. And after a couple minutes, I was there for probably literally a good 5 minutes in the prone, ready to shoot, just tracking him back and forth with my scope, waiting for him to clear all the other antelope, waiting for him to give me a good broadside shot with a good backstop behind him. And eventually he came down enough that there was solid ground behind him that would catch that bullet, and he stopped broadside. His left side was facing me, so his head was facing to the left. He put his head down to eat and said, okay, this is going to be it. And meanwhile, there was a pretty stiff wind going on that morning. I found out later it was gusting to about 20 miles an hour, so 10 to 20 mile an hour wind. And it was about a third or a half value wind. So it was coming kind of diagonal from them to me. So it wasn't a straight crosswind, but it wasn't straight from them to me. So like I said, half, maybe a third value crosswind, but it was pretty stiff. And so I was like, at this point I'd stopped ranging them. I knew that at their furthest away at this point, they were about a little over 200 yards, and they just kept getting closer and closer. My zero was for 200 yards, and I knew that they weren't that much closer than that. So I figured it was probably 150 to 200 yard shot. And my rifle was zeroed at 200, and I knew that even with that stiff wind, the fact that it wasn't a full value wind, and the fact that it was such a close shot, and the fact that I was using a real high BC bullet, gave me confidence that the wind hold isn't going to be too bad. So I kind of shaded forward just a little bit into the wind, but not so far forward that if I misjudged it, that I wouldn't hit his vitals. And so I aimed kind of right on his shoulder, and very gently squeezed the trigger, and the gun discharged, and he staggered at the shot. And so, like I said, he was facing to the left, and he immediately whipped around and started running to the right. And when he did that, I could see that there was like a softball-sized red spot on his other side from the exit wounds. So, okay, I made a good shot on him. I quickly chambered another round, and I was tracking him, getting ready to shoot again if necessary, and he ran just a little bit, 10 to 20 yards, and then started making a big circle and just kind of plopped over and fell over right there. And that was it for him, man. He was done. Now, the reaction of the does was very, very interesting because, like I said, he was in a group. There was maybe 10 total antelope there, maybe less. And I shot him, and he started running, and all the does kind of took off running with him, but they looked like they were running more because he was running than anything else. They looked kind of confused, and they didn't look real disturbed. And then when he fell over right there, they all just kind of stood around and looked at him for a minute. And then, they just put their heads back down and started eating and acting like normal. It was very interesting. And I think that was from the combination of, one, I was shooting suppressed, so the rifle was not very loud. The wind was blowing from them to me, and that also kind of obscured the noise of that suppressed rifle shot even more. And then the fact that he just ran a little bit and fell over, also, well, he's not running anymore. I don't know what's going on. And they hung out there for a while. We sat there just for a couple minutes. He twitched and kicked for a minute or two when he was down on the ground, and I was watching him through my scope. He was behind a bush when he fell, but I was watching him there. I was like, all right, just make sure, be real cautious here. Make sure he doesn't get up and run away on me. And then we stopped moving. I got up, and Cliff started walking towards him, and then at that point, all the does and fawns ran off, and that was the end of it. And so I'm not exactly certain how far my shot was from. I marked my spot on Onyx where I shot him, and then I marked where I found him on Onyx, and I marked where I think was the start of his tracks from where he started running, and it was about a 190-yard shot, so just shy of 200 yards, not that far of a shot, not very difficult, and everything worked out just about perfectly with that. I shot that antelope using Hornady Precision Hunter ammo with the 143 grain ELDX bullet. I know, that's the most unoriginal thing to use in the 6.5 Creedmoor. Believe me, I tried to find something else, but that rifle did not like most of the stuff I was feeding it, for instance. It was kind of surprising. Now, I tried the Barnes Vortex long range load with the 127 grain LRX. The rifle hated it. Tried the Hornady Outfitter load with the 120 grain CX, and it hated it. I tried the Federal Terminal Ascent load with the 130 grain Terminal Ascent, and it hated it too. And I was about to give up on using that rifle when I tried the Hornady Precision Hunter stuff almost out of desperation, and it shot darn near half MOA. Kind of surprising to me considering the luck I was having with those other loads. So that was what I used. Really, that load, looking back on it, was just about perfect for the situation. Not only did it shoot great, but that really high BC bullet was ideal for use in those windy conditions, even though it was still not a very long shot. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And the terminal performance was astonishing. So I hit that antelope behind the shoulder, and it opened up fast when it hit those ribs. Upon closer inspection, after butchering it, that bullet hit one rib square on, and the expansion was rapid and violent. The entrance hole was about the size of a silver dollar. It annihilated the lungs, took off the top of the heart, and then left about a 3-inch diameter exit wound on the other side. And remember, that was just through the chest cavity. It hit rib bones, rib meat, lungs, and heart, but that was it. No real muscle or major bones other than ribs to speak of. And so, like I said, he only went 10 to 20 yards after the shot. And that bullet was only going about 2,500 feet per second when it hit, right? I mean, it's a 6.5 Creedmoor, not a 300 Win Mag or a 300 Ultra Mag. I could not have placed that bullet much better either, and it also just really delivered the goods. And I can't say enough good things about that whole setup that I had. The suppressor was great. The rifle shot really well. It was really dampened the noise of it, and like I said, the reaction of the does was very interesting. Who knows what would have happened if I would have missed or something like that. But it's possible they all would have just kind of stood there for a minute and given me another chance to shoot one of them. And at the same time, if there would have been 2 bucks there, there's a good chance that if there would have been another guy there with me, I could have shot that first one suppressed, and then they're more likely to have kind of stood around and let another hunter shoot that other buck before running off. So really cool. And I also, like I said, I used that Spartan Precision Pro Hunt Tech, or I guess the Pro Hunt bipod, and it was also great. That was the first hunt I've ever actually, first animal anyway, I've ever actually shot using that bipod, and it was perfect. And so it was interesting, the reaction not only of the antelope to the suppressor, but of Cliff to the suppressor. Because like I said, at the beginning of the day, he was very skeptical of it and real nervous, and he thought it was illegal and all that stuff. And we shot this antelope early in the morning, and he was, wow, man, that was really cool. And he kept talking on and on and on about all of the reaction of the other antelope in the herd and how that's very unusual, because even though he hunts on private land, it's a lot of those antelopes still get spooky pretty fast. If someone shoots at them, man, they all just kind of take off running. And, he and I were talking about the process to get it for the rest of the day and everything. And at the end of the day, he wanted to buy one and asked me where he could get it, what you got to do to get it, and how much it costs and all that stuff. So he went from being real skeptical to wanting to buy his own at the end of the day. So all things considered, it also just happened that I was the first guy in the whole group to kill anything that morning. I think we were done with the photos and done field dressing that antelope by about 8 in the morning. It was pretty windy, and like I said, it was like 20 miles an hour when I shot, and it got even worse in the afternoon, and it also started raining here and there as well. So the conditions got kind of challenging as the day went on. Weston from Axel shot his antelope a little after I got mine. He was hunting with a different guide, but he shot his 8:45, 9 o'clock in the morning, something like that. But he and I were the only guys to get our antelope that day. So for that reason, Weston and I got to go hunt bison the next day. Steve and Colin got their bison on day 1, so they came back and hunted with Cliff after I left for antelope. Everyone else had another go at the antelope on day 2. Now, like I mentioned, we had quite the drive ahead of us. We left the lodge at 5 a.m. with everyone else, and then we spent the next 4 hours driving up to where the bison were. Now, I don't want to give you the wrong impression on the bison or make this part of the trip out to be something that it wasn't. This was not like I drew a Henry Mountains or an Antelope Island bison tag where I could hunt free-range bison. Freddie referenced this in the previous podcast, but these bison were behind a fence. Everything else he outfits hunts for is free-range: deer, elk, antelope, cougar, turkey, etc. But this is a privately owned bison herd, not managed by the state of Colorado, so they're required to be contained behind a high fence. And the fence that I mentioned earlier, crossing with the antelope, that was a low fence for cattle. You know, the antelope, deer, all that stuff have no issues going back and forth across that. Anyway, so every pursuit of an animal involves a certain amount of quote-unquote hunting and a certain amount of quote-unquote shooting. Certain animals, certain situations will shift that slider more towards the hunting side of things or more towards the shooting side of things. Well, this is a case where it was biased more strongly towards a shoot or a harvest. And really, that's the situation with probably 90+% of all the bison that people shoot in North America each year. Even Craig Boddington once wrote that in most situations, taking a bison is more of a collection than a hunt. End of quote. Now, some people shoot their bison in a 100-acre enclosure. Others shoot it in a bigger one. A very few people kill a truly free-range bison these days, but it does happen. So like I said, I just want to be upfront with you on that, and I don't want anyone to think that I was making this out to be something that it wasn't. But all that said, it was still really cool and really interesting. These bison were in about a 5,000-acre enclosure, and everyone in the group that was hunting, including me, was targeting a 2-year-old quote-unquote non-trophy bull. For reference, a giant bull bison that's fully mature will weigh over 2,000 pounds. These non-trophy bulls all weighed around 1,000 pounds. So they're about half the size that they'd be when they're fully grown, but they are still gigantic, and even this animal is still significantly bigger than most animals that anyone is going to kill in their life, to include an elk. And from what I hear, the meat is absolutely delicious on these younger bulls too, which was our primary goal here, aside from the experience itself. Anyway, I was up first on the bison for day 2. I talked with the guides up there, and they also gave approval to use my CVA Paramount muzzleloader. As insurance, I suggested bringing my .375 as well when we went out hunting, and they thought that was a good plan. So we hopped in an ATV and headed out looking for the herd. Took us 30 to 45 minutes to find them, and then we sat back at a decent range to pick out the right bull without disturbing them, right? Because we were looking for a bull of a specific age, not a cow, not a really young bull, not an old mature bull, etc. So after a few minutes, we found what looked like a suitable bison that kind of checked all the right boxes there. It was the right size, and it was on the edge of the herd, so we could make an approach. Now, the trick here is to find the right bison that's also in the right spot where we can shoot it without hitting another one in the process. As herd animals, they like to group up, and it can be tricky to get a clean shot on one. And it took a while, but we did manage to get into a position where I had a clean shot on a suitable bull. So I laid down, got steady, and then took aim just behind and below the ear, right where I was instructed to shoot. I felt rock solid there. Once again, I was using my Spartan Precision bipod, and I also had my rear bag. So I breathed out and squeezed the trigger. I heard a sickening pop, followed by a loud boom a half second later. When the smoke cleared, the bison was still on his feet, shaking his head. As it turned out, I had a hang fire. My trigger squeeze was good, but my follow-through was not. We'll talk more about this in a second, but I have a nasty habit of lifting my head up to see where I hit when I shoot that particular rifle. It's an absolute tack driver, but I still shouldn't do that. That's bad form, and this is a good reason how you can get into trouble doing that. In this case, my poor follow-through combined with that slight delay in ignition was enough to result in a wounded bison. My worst nightmare. Not everything will go as planned, though, and this is one of those moments where it's important to roll with the punches and sort things out before they really go sideways. Within seconds, a bunch of bison had surrounded this one and started messing with him. Sensing weakness, they were poking him with their horns and pushing him around. With all the smoke and dust, it was really hard to tell what was going on, but that bison did eventually start walking off on his own away from the herd after a couple minutes. We were fortunately able to separate him from the herd, which greatly simplified things with the follow-up. Now, thankfully, I brought that .375 with me. I had 4 rounds in the magazine. I didn't put one in the chamber, but I just pushed all 4 into the magazine. I did that before we went out after the bison, so I just had to work the bolt and chamber around to get it ready. One of the guides brought a big backpack out on our stalk, and that was a good rest in combination with that rear bag that I had. I was not using the bipod on this one. So The bison was away from the herd, and it was slowly walking in a kind of like a diagonal away from us direction. And he was out in the open. There was a good backstop beside him, or rather behind him. And so I laid down, got ready, and got a range. And he was, say, 126 yards for this next shot, something like that, a little over 100 yards. I aimed right on his front shoulder, squeezed the trigger, and boom, man, I hit it. And you could hear that bullet just slap into him. And he kind of picked up the pace after that and started running. And I worked the bolt and got ready to shoot again. And at this point, the range had opened up a little bit more, and he was angling farther away from us. And so I really couldn't see the shoulder on this one. So I aimed right at his rear hip on the right side of his body, fired again, and boom, hit him. And you could hear that bullet also slap into him as see dust come off of him. And he really staggered at this one. And he walked a little bit farther and actually laid down right there. And laid down and was his rear was facing us, but he started looking back over his shoulder, though, and I could get a clear shot at his head. And at this point, he was about 150 yards away, and I very carefully aimed at his neck, fired, hit him again. You hear that big slap and boom, and he just dropped right there. And that was the end of that for the bison. Now, I was using Federal Cape Shock 300 grain Barnes TSX ammo, and my goodness, that stuff worked great. My first shot with the CVA Paramount actually hit the poor bison in the jaw, and I still feel like a jerk for doing that. My first shot with the 375 was on his right side, and like I said, I aimed at his shoulder, but he was far enough away and moving faster than I thought he was, where I actually hit pretty far back on him on that one. That shot hit him a little bit behind the vitals, but he was angling away, so I hit his liver and then clipped the rear of his left lung with that initial shot. And so not a great shot, but I did hit vitals on that one, and that bullet, we actually recovered it right under the hide at the other side. It gave a good around 3 feet of penetration and was opened up just picture perfect. You could use that in a Barnes or a Federal advertisement. It was great. 100%, actually, it's over 100% weight retention because I think it has a little bit of the bison still stuck to it. In any case, he turned even more strongly quartering away from me with that next shot that I took on him. So shot number 2 from the 375. I hit him just in front of the right hip, and it angled up through the intestines, the stomach, hit the liver, and just annihilated that left lung. And since he was quartering strongly enough away from me, that bullet was going kind of diagonally through his body, but more lengthwise through his body than straight across it. And so that shot hit him right at the rear of that left lung and went basically just straight forward, almost straight forward through that whole lung, and then lodged just inside the left front shoulder. So over 4 feet of penetration from that bullet. And when we butchered that bison, had another real big hole straight through the liver, and then like a golf ball sized hole through that left lung. And interestingly, that was the one that really staggered him and put him down. And he was probably dead at that point from the amount of damage that those 2 shots had done to him. But that final shot right through the spine there as he was looking back on us ended it for good. So while that part of the trip did not go like I hoped it would, I feel like I recovered and I salvaged that situation as well as I could. Now, as it turned out, my 300 Win Mag never left the gun case, but the 375, which was the backup to the backup, ended up killing 2 bison that day. That one, and then Weston shot his with it as well. This was a really good lesson in the importance of using enough gun. I feel very confident that my Paramount would have done the job if I would have hit where I was aiming, but there is no comparison between the Paramount and the 375 H&H with those Barnes bullets when it comes to follow-up shots like I had to deliver. A strongly quartering away, a raking shot where you're shooting through the paunch to reach the vitals on a big animal like that is asking a lot out of a bullet. So you have to have something that is really going to penetrate like crazy because there's a lot of bullets that say on that, especially on that second shot that I made with my 375, I would have hit him in the guts, and the bullet would have stayed in the guts, and it wouldn't have done too much more than that. But this one had plenty of juice to get all the way up into the vitals, which is exactly what you want in a situation like that. So that 375 with that 300 grain Barnes TSX delivered phenomenal performance and devastating results on that Bison. This is a great example why that is such a highly recommended cartridge bullet combination on Cape Buffalo. Recoil was not bad, but it still has a good amount of reach, more than you would think for a dangerous game cartridge, and it just freaking works on animals like that. And like I said, Weston also shot his Bison with that rifle. And just real quick, we got it was standing a little bit apart from the herd, but still in a little bit of a group. We had a clean shot on it, though, and he ended up shooting it. It was strongly quartering towards him. He shot it just in front of its left shoulder and got both lungs, the liver, and it exited. Left a real big exit wound on the other side. And it hit the brachial plexus nerve complex there right up on the shoulder. And so that Bison kept trying to use that left front shoulder or that left front leg, and it could put it down and immediately put it back up. It was just kind of standing there on one of them. So got it real good on that, and it got the vitals. The other Bison kept kind of circling and milling around it, so he never got another follow-up shot on it. And it took a minute or two, but it did eventually lay down and die right there after a single shot from the 375. And so once again, just worked great. And that rifle had probably never been used to kill anything, and went from nothing to having 2 Bison to its name just in the space of a couple hours. Now, Bison are not Cape Buffalo, but they're still a really big animal. Even this non-trophy bull that I shot at 1,000 pounds, a mature Cape Buffalo bull is probably going to be about 50% bigger, and it's going to live in much different terrain. In any case, this is an example of how things can go wrong and why it's important to have a plan for when that happens, to stay calm, and then to do your utmost to resolve that situation as quickly as possible. I had a bit of a rough start with that Bison, but it ended well, and I felt like I did a pretty good job with my follow-through. I make no excuses for my initial shot on the Bison. I did indeed have a hang fire, but that was also probably my fault, and I take responsibility for it. Additionally, if my follow-through would have been as good as it should have been, even with the hang fire, I might have made a good shot and killed that Bison with the initial shot from my CVA Paramount. Here's what I think happened with that hang fire, though. I normally have a very precise and strict regimen for dealing with my muzzle loaders. I always use fresh primers and fresh powder when I go hunting for the most consistent performance and to reduce the odds of a hang fire or a misfire. The fact is, I got careless, though. I went to the range near my house in Texas a few days before the hunt, and I brought my Paramount. I normally pre-measure all my powder charges before going to the range, and I keep them in pre-loaded tubes to save time at the range. Well, I went to the range, and things went great. The rifle was shooting awesome, but I didn't shoot all my pre-loaded charges or pre-selected primers that day. I think I had 9 tubes ready to go of powder, and I shot 6 or 7, something like that. I think it's literally the first time I've done that. Normally, I shoot all my pre-measured charges, but I was so busy that day shooting the other 3 rifles I was planning on bringing that to get them dialed in that I shot that 6, 7 shots with it, and I said, okay, we're good. I'm going to put this away, clean it, and be done with it. Well, I got lazy, and I did not discard those charges or set them aside for use at the range later. I reloaded my other powder tubes and my other Veriflame adapters with fresh primers, but then I mixed all the new stuff together with all the old stuff. Now, when I went up to Colorado on day 1, the Paramount shot great at the range. My last shot with that thing was literally a bullseye with it right after I adjusted the scope to account for the different elevation change. That's when I made my next mistake, though. The ranch had a garage where everyone could keep all their hunting gear, right? Your dirty boots, dirty jackets, all that stuff. And we also left our rifles out there. As is the case with most garages, that one isn't climate controlled like the main house, so the temperature fluctuated more out there than it did inside. I had all my muzzleloader stuff inside a sealed 50 caliber ammo can, and I've also literally never had an issue with my Paramount misfiring or hang firing in the 3 years I've owned it. So I think I just got overconfident and careless. and I paid the price. Murphy's Law says that what can go wrong will go wrong, and at the worst possible time, it'll go wrong. That's what happened here. So looking back on things, I think I happened to use one of the old powder tubes that morning when I went out to hunt. Or I might have used an old primer, or I might have done both. Either way, I had a primer-powder combination that had been out of their unsealed container for longer than usual and was out in the non-climate-controlled elements of that garage for 2 full days and nights and was just exposed to too much moisture in the air in the process. It was a tiny change, but it was enough for a tiny hang fire, which was enough for a giant mess. Muzzleloaders can be kind of a pain, and they require more care and diligence than a centerfire rifle. That's why I have such strict procedures for cleaning my muzzleloader and for handling all my gear. I didn't follow my own rules, and sure enough, I had a hang fire. So like I said, I take responsibility here. But I'm also glad I had the foresight to bring the 375. So those 2 things are the 2 biggest lessons learned from this hunt. Be diligent with your muzzleloader and make sure you're using something that will still work if things go sideways. After all, I'm sure you could definitely kill a bison with a brain or a spine shot from a 6.5 Creedmoor. But my goodness, you'd be in a pickle if you botched that initial shot. A 300 Win Mag still wouldn't be ideal, but it would work a lot better. So that's another thing to consider when preparing for a hunt. Lots of things will kill lots of animals if things work perfectly, but that list narrows considerably when the situation is not perfect. In my podcasts and in my emails, I talk a lot about the importance of using something that will still cleanly kill a bull elk if all you get is a steeply quartering shot at 350 yards on the last night of your hunt. In that same vein, it's also worth considering whether or not you're using something that will give you the power and penetration you need to reach the vitals in the event you mess up and wound that elk with your first shot, and you need to take a couple of raking shots like I had to do on this bison. There's cartridges and bullets that will do that, and then there's those that won't. All right, that's enough about the bison for right now. Next, antelope are hard to approach closely. This is true in areas with lighter hunting pressure, but it's also especially tough on public land that is hunted pretty heavily. So that's why it's so important to use any available cover or concealment to screen your movements from the antelope, so you can close that distance to a more reasonable shooting distance without them seeing you and spooking. Drainage ditches and creek beds are fantastic for this, but you can also do the same with gentle folds in the terrain like I did. Very few places are completely flat, so you can often find something to use to get closer to the antelope after you spot them. My description of ridges in this hunt, like I said, was very generous, and those folds in the terrain were only maybe 5 to 6 feet of elevation difference. Now, Cliff and I were hidden from the antelope when standing at the very bottom of that tiny fold in the terrain, but our heads were poking up at the top when we started walking up the opposite slope. So we walked crouched over for a ways until we reached those electric poles. And at that point, we each stood behind one and just peeked out the sides. Then I eventually crawled on my belly until I closed the distance to the point where I had a clear shot at close range. And when I did that, I kept that bush between the antelope and me. On all my hunts, I found they don't key in on the form of a head poking around a bush or a telephone pole or the form of a human crawling nearly as bad as they do with an upright human walking towards them. That isn't a guaranteed way to get close to antelope, but it will really help. You just need to be willing to get creative and willing and able to do a little bit of crawling. This hunt required about 100 yards of crawling, maybe a little more. My Wyoming hunt I talked about in episode 192 was similar, but my other antelope hunt in Colorado I talked about in episode 47 required a lot more. If I recall correctly, we spotted that buck at about 900 yards, and I eventually shot him at 150 yards a couple hours later after covering all that distance either on my belly or on my knees. I personally think that's half the fun of an antelope hunt, and I'd rather crawl 700 yards for a closer range shot than shoot one at 500 or 600 yards, but that's just me. Now finally, antelope country is often windy. I think, like I said, I was dealing with winds gusting up to about 20 miles an hour when I shot my antelope. I was inside 200 yards when I made the shot, so it wasn't a gigantic deal. However, that high BC 143 grain ELDX was ideal for that situation, and a 10 mile an hour crosswind will result in about 2 inches of wind deflection at that range. So, not, like I said, not a giant deal, something, but not a giant deal. Now, in a situation like that where there's a moderate to strong wind, but I'm not 100% sure of my wind hold, And when the range is on the short side, I'll shoot into the wind a tiny bit. This can be tricky and it's easy to overestimate the wind. So what I'll often do is favor one side of the vitals. The wind was blowing left to right, so I aimed at the left edge of the vitals, but still aiming at a spot where I'd hit the vitals and still cleanly kill the animal, even if I overestimated the wind. As it turned out, I aimed at the left edge of the vitals and hit dead center. Now, while I was dealing with a 20 mile an hour or so crosswind, it wasn't full value. Like I said, 1/3 to 1/2 value, but it was strong enough to have to consider, especially at longer ranges. Now, high BC bullets really come into their own when dealing with wind. Velocity is important, but not nearly as important as BC is. For what it's worth, Adam, also known as Hootie Hoo, was using a 120 grain Remington core lock from his 25-06 on this hunt. I'm not at all giving him a hard time here or anything like that. He cleanly killed his antelope. I'm just using this as an example. That load from the 25-06 is about 200 to 250 feet per second faster muzzle velocity than my Creedmoor. But even so, the 120 grain Remington core lock has a very low BC. It's like 0.36 something. Well, those low BC bullets had about 50% more wind deflection at 200 yards and nearly a foot more wind deflection at 500 yards with a 10 mile an hour crosswind. Now, shooting an antelope at 500 yards with anything is challenging if you're dealing with any wind at all, but a low BC bullet like that makes it much harder. I wouldn't necessarily recommend shooting one with a 20 mile an hour gusting wind, even with a 6.5 Creedmoor or 6.5 PRC or something like that with a high BC bullet. I'm just saying it's easier to deal with the wind with cartridges and bullets that are both faster and use higher BC bullets. Take all that for what you will, but hunts like this one are definitely where you can really get a lot of good use out of a high BC bullet, like the Hornady ELDX, the Nosler AccuBot long range, etc. Now finally, I used a Spartan Precision Javelin Pro Hunt bipod on this hunt. It worked perfect. I carried it in my bino harness for most of the time I was out there, then slapped it on my rifle when it was time to shoot. Those adjustable legs were great for getting the right amount of elevation to shoot over that small rise in front of me, and the whole setup was perfect for getting my rifle level and steady in that somewhat uneven terrain. You won't be able to use a bipod on every hunt, at least to shoot from the prone anyway, but I have used one to shoot all 3 of my pronghorn. Conditions on those hunts won't always work with a bipod, but of everything I've hunted, the terrain is just typically more conducive to using a bipod when hunting antelope than is the case with other species. So get a bipod if you plan on going out after antelope in the future, and I highly recommend one from Spartan Precision in particular. Now, I did not get a video of my antelope hunt, but I did get a video of me shooting the bison to include the part with the muzzleloader. I am not going to put that video on YouTube for consumption by the world at large because I think the context of this video is very important, but I have put it on my Patreon channel where subscribers can view it. Like I said, things don't always go as planned out there, and I'm not afraid to show you the times when I make a mistake in order to help get some of those lessons across to you. There's nothing like seeing the consequences of a hang fire in real time to illustrate the importance of keeping your powder and primers dry. Likewise, the same is true for the importance of using something like my 375 that can deliver incredible penetration and devastating terminal performance if you need something to bat cleanup. Go to patreon.com/biggamehunter and sign up to support me there to see that video. Now, finally, as we wrap up, like I said, make sure you're on my email list with a confirmed email address. Email me directly, john@thebiggamehuntingblog.com, and we'll sort it out and make sure you're good to go so you can potentially win that Cabela's gift card. All right, that is it for today. Remember, you can make your dream hunt turn into a reality, and I can help. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you back here next time on the Big Game Hunting Podcast.
This show may be over, but we have plenty more for you on our website. For more information on today's topic, as well as lots of other useful hunting resources, head over to thebiggamehuntingblog.com. We look forward to having you back for the next episode. But until then, happy hunting.